impressed me, especially in the last few weeks since I've been back from England and during the short visit that I had back in the spring. That is the large number of homes that are being broken up in our day and in this country in which we live. And I have pretty well resolved not to conduct any meeting without having a few words to say about the permanence of the family and permanence of marriage as God has designed it. I think one thing that we have lost sight of is the fact that God is the author of marriage, and as the author of marriage, He has retained the authority to regulate and control marriage. Many people talk of marriage and think about marriage totally without consideration for God's will at all. I have a rather thick book that I have studied somewhat on this subject, a book that's discussed and used in college classes on marriage. One of the first statements that's made in it is that no one really knows the origin of the home arrangement, that it is hidden somewhere in the dim shadows of antiquity. Well, this just means that this man who professes to be an expert on the subject of home and family doesn't know the first thing about it. Now, he may know some other things, but he doesn't know the first thing. He doesn't know the origin of it. And if we do not know the origin of it and do not know the authority over it, then we are scarcely prepared to discuss the matter with any kind of satisfaction. God is the author of it, and God retains control over it. The beginning of marriage is described in the first and second chapters of Genesis, where God created man and saw, after man had sought to name the animals, that there was no creature there that was suitable as a companion for him, none that could share all of his attributes and characteristics. And so we're told that God caused man to sleep and took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Now that's the end of Adam's statement. Now God speaks, verse 24, Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Now, here we have the institution of marriage, the beginning of marriage. It was made for man's happiness, for man's good. And this arrangement, which God made in the beginning, He intended should continue for all time. When He said, For this cause shall man leave father and mother and cleave to his wife, He was not talking about Adam, because Adam had no father and mother to leave. Rather, He was stating a principle. He was stating a rule for mankind throughout history. Now, it may be observed by some that this is in the Old Testament, and that we are under a new covenant, and that's true. But there's no change in the law of God, for when Jesus was asked about marriage, He asked He spoke of what was in the beginning. In verse 5 of Mark 10, He speaks of a temporary arrangement that Moses had made. But He said in verse 6, From the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. So then they are no more twain, but one flesh. And then Jesus added to what God had said. Wherefore, therefore, what God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. So the same rule that God had made in the beginning, that a man should leave father and mother, cleave to his wife, they two should be one flesh, and the same necessity which God laid upon Adam of living with the wife as long as they lived, since He created no other for him, this same requirement is made of men in all ages, as Jesus has brought over that law of God into this dispensation, adding, as we've suggested, that what God hath joined together, man should not put asunder. Now, this has always worked for the good of mankind. In societies where the relationship between husband and wife has been counted inviolable, the best interests of man have been served. It is in such society that the greatest stability is attained, the greatest security, and the greatest happiness. And when this arrangement is broken down then problems inevitably follow. Cardinal Gibbons, in analyzing the causes for the destruction of the Roman Empire, traced, among other causes, traced back one of the causes to the breakdown of the home and the breakdown of marriage. One of 5 causes that he gave. Russia thought in the beginning of the communist society in Russia that they could improve upon the home, and so they tried to rearrange the family unit, the family arrangement. But they were wise enough to see what it was doing to their national existence, and went back to a pretty carefully structured home and family similar to what God originally ordained. In this country, we hear people talking about new structure for the family. In a book by Vance Packard, there is a list of about 8 or 10 variations which are thought possible arrangements for home and family in the future, all of them different from the plan that God has given. But those who believe in the Bible and those who recognize God as the author of man's life and of man's social arrangements, who realize that God has authority over mankind, will be faithful and true to this plan that God has given for a man to leave father and mother, cleave to his wife, and remain one flesh as God intended until death shall separate them. But now, having said that marriage is to be permanent for all time, that is, throughout all ages, we want to bring that down to a more specific point to suggest that each marriage that is formed is intended to be permanent. I'd like to read again from Mark, the 10th chapter, as we read it a moment ago, except looking just a little more closely at what was being said. In the 2nd verse of the 10th chapter of Mark, the Pharisees came to Jesus asking him, "Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife?" tempting him. And he answered and said unto them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses suffered to write a bill of divorcement and to put her away." Jesus answered and said unto them, "For the hardness of your heart he wrote you this precept. But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female." And I want you to note again what we suggested a moment ago, that God made just one woman for that one man. Really, there was no choice for them. They had to live together as husband and wife as long as they lived. But then Jesus continued, "For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh." That is, two shall form one basic biological unit, one family unit. So then they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. And in the house his disciples asked him again of the same matter. And he saith unto them, "Whosoever shall put away his wife and marry another committeth adultery against her. And if a woman shall put away her husband and be married to another, she committeth adultery." Now, these are the words of Christ, and if any words of Christ are to be respected, then most certainly these must be respected. You're familiar with the fact, and I do not have to inform you. In fact, I'm not even going to try to quote statistics to suggest that families today are not as permanent as God intends. In fact, divorce is all about us. It is being seen not simply among the people of the world, but it's being seen among people in the Lord's church. It is being seen among preachers to an alarming degree. It is being observed among elders of the church. I've seen elders just completely go off and leave their family, or the family sometimes leave the elder. And of course this dissolves his responsibilities as an elder. He can no longer serve. And numerous men and numerous good women have lost their influence and been unable to do the great work God would have them to do because their family life has been interfered with and interrupted. The home is no longer as permanent, as stable as it once was. What are some causes of this? Well, we just have to suggest them briefly. I think one of these is the hedonistic philosophy, the idea that pleasure is the ultimate good. One of the characteristics of pleasure is that it never completely satisfies. When a person lives for pleasure, he must have ever-increasing experiences to keep him high, to keep him happy. You know, drugs are that way. We know that a person begins, and for a little while a certain amount will give him a kick, but then he has to have more and more and more and more. And so it is with pleasure. And the first chapter of Romans describes the search of the Gentile world for pleasure. When a person marries, of course, there is pleasure which God intends should be experienced and enjoyed in marriage, but the person who's living for pleasure must have more and more experiences to satisfy him. And after a while, the wife doesn't satisfy him, or he thinks that someone else will. And he looks to other women, and the woman sometimes looks to other men and becomes dissatisfied with their own companionship, with their own partnership. And in the pursuit of pleasure, they destroy the marriage bond which God has formed. A second problem is materialism. We seem to feel that we have a right to all of the material possessions that are possessed by people around us. And people go into debt for these things. And wives become dissatisfied with their husbands because their husbands can't provide them with what others are providing them with. And sometimes they try to provide it by going into debt and then can't pay the debts. And tensions mount and increase because of materialism. Another thing is this I'm number one philosophy. There was a time when people maybe practiced that, a good many did, not all individuals, but many. But they were ashamed of it. They wouldn't come out right out with it and boast of it. But now books are being written encouraging individuals to put themselves first. You have a right to what you want. You have a right to be what you want to be. And you shouldn't let anybody else get in your way. And you're a lady down in Atlanta that read some of these books, and before long she was talking in those terms. She said, all my life I've been doing what my husband wanted me to do, or I've been doing what my children wanted me to do, or I've been doing what the church wanted me to do. And a lady who had been considered a strong influence for good in the church, a stalwart Christian, just went right off and left her husband and went off with another man and destroyed her own influence, and her whole family fell apart. Her own children then began the same course she had followed, and before long the whole family that had been considered a strong family in the Lord had just fallen apart, fallen to pieces. And it all went back to the fact that she and another member or two of her family, and one member of the family told me this, had been reading some of these books that stress the fact that you have a right to whatever you want, and you shouldn't let anybody get in your way. Climb up over everybody else to attain your desires, because that's what they're doing, and you just well have your piece of the pie, and in fact you have a right to the whole pie if you can manage to obtain it. That's the point. And people are buying that, not simply buying the books, but reading the books and practicing the philosophy that is around about us everywhere. I believe that the entertainment industry contributes to it. The soap operas, we think of about the only thing on the television that's harmful as being either the sex shows or the violence. But I believe that we allow ourselves to be brainwashed sometime by the soap operas. Here are all these individuals who come to be more or less hero figures to us, and this fellow's wife is not treating him right, and here's this nice little girl in the office, and we just wish he could get rid of that old wife and marry this nice girl in the office, and we root for that divorce, and we're just so happy when it comes about, when the marriage comes, and the bells are ringing and everything, and it's sinful according to God's law. It's sinful. But, it's just a play, you see. But over a period of time of rooting for divorce and remarriage and rejoicing in adultery, our whole system is anesthetized, and we no longer are sensitive to it. And then when a similar problem arises in the church, well, it doesn't seem too bad because we've been rooting for this for years. Or especially if it's in our own family, in our own home, well, we are just not sensitive to the seriousness of the whole matter. And of course, the ease of divorce itself is contributing to the breakdown of the home. When things don't go right, it's a very simple matter just to go out to a lawyer and pay him a certain amount of money, and as it is true, it's true in most cases, most states, that if you've got the money, you can get the divorce no matter whether the companion wants it or doesn't want it. And so marriages break down all around us. What must we do? Well, just two or three thoughts. First of all, in our own home, once we have formed a marriage, we must endure, we must hold out. As we suggested yesterday morning, we've promised to love, to honor, to cherish, not simply in health, but in sickness. Not simply in prosperity, but in adversity. Not simply when things are going right, but when they're going wrong. That's what we've promised. And having promised it, it is right for us to continue with our promise. Somebody might say, well, I made a mistake when I promised. Well, one of the characteristics of the God-fearing man is that he swears to his own hurt and changes not. If we made a mistake, then let's just make the best of it. If I make a mistake and lose my arm in an accident, or lose my fingers in the lawnmower, well, I've made a mistake, but that doesn't mean I can go back and make it right. It's just one of those mistakes I'll have to live with, and so I just learn to live with it. I just make the best of it. I adapt myself to the situation. And we must realize that when we've made a mistake in marriage, as many people have, that they simply must recognize the fact that they've made a mistake and say, well, I'm going to make the best of it. I'm going to work it out. Now, people sometimes say, well, but God wants us to be happy, doesn't he? Yes, he wants us to be happy. And that's the reason he warns us that marriage is permanent, that when we make it, it's for life. And he knows that that is for our happiness. Many, many times, in fact, a large percentage of the time, when people are in a bad situation and they break it up with divorce to marry somebody else, they find they haven't really helped themselves all that much. Just look at the number of people that have been divorced and remarried more than once, 2 or 3 times. All of which just demonstrates that they really didn't solve their problems. Their problems most often were within them. And you take a person who has a problem within him and he can divorce and marry 10 times, and he's still going to have the same problems. This is not for our happiness. And God is concerned about society as well as he is concerned about us as individuals. And the greatest happiness always is attained by doing God's will, by following God's rules and God's way. And the earlier we begin with that, of course, the better off we are. That leads me to the second thought, that not only must we determine that we'll simply do the best we can to make our marriage work, even if we have made a mistake, but in the second place, we'll teach our children to be careful about their marriage. From the very infancy, we should begin preparing them for marriage. And as soon as they're old enough to be talked with about it, we begin telling them that they are marrying permanently. I was up in Lafayette some years ago in a department store up there. And there was a little girl about 6 years old, I guess, talking to the sales lady there in the store. And the sales lady was just making a little conversation with her while her mother was out shopping. And she said, what you going to do when you get grown? She said, I want to marry. Well, that's all right. Then the sales clerk said, well, what if your husband doesn't treat you right? She said, I'll trade him off and get another one. 6 years old already, talking about the possibility of divorce and remarriage. We must teach our children that when they get married, they're going to marry for keeps. And impress upon the importance of marrying not simply the kind of boy or the kind of girl who may be attractive at the moment, but the kind that will be a good companion for years to come. And this kind of training has to be done before they get into the dating and courting years, because once they get their affections attached on somebody, you're just whistling in the graveyard when you try to tell them that they've got problems. You just about out of love. They must be trained from the very beginning to understand the permanence of marriage. And in that same connection, they must be taught to marry somebody who understands the permanence of marriage also. Some of the saddest situations I've ever seen were young people who understood that marriage was permanent, who married boys or girls who did not consider it permanent. And of course, the one who considers it permanent has every disadvantage. He's the one that has to endure everything, to put up with all the problems, suffer all of the hardships, because the other one's just ready to divorce at the drop of a hat. They're ready to go off and leave. And so the one who believes in the permanence of marriage is the one who has to do all the giving and all the taking and all the suffering and all the enduring. Teach our children not only that marriage is permanent, but that they must marry someone who understands that marriage is permanent. The third thing that I would suggest is this, that as counselors, in talking with people, friends who come to talk with us, urge that marriage is permanent. A great deal of harm is done by individuals who talk with their friends and encourage the breakup of homes. When a person comes to me, they always want sympathy, of course. Man comes telling me how bad his wife's treating him. He wants sympathy. And it's natural for me to say, well, friend, I sure feel sorry for you. She just ought not treat you that way. You sure aren't getting the right kind of a deal. I just wouldn't put up with it if I were you. That's the natural tendency on our part. And I have known of Christians who profess to be faithful to the Lord, who would talk that way to an individual to their face and then go away and admit that the person wasn't even right. But we tell them what they want to hear. That's no friend. A friend tells them what they need to hear. And whenever a husband or a wife comes to us for advice and counsel, we need to encourage them to hold a marriage together if there's any way in the world to hold it together. That's the only kind of advice that we can afford. Well, someone says your time's about up. Isn't there an exception to this rule that marriage is permanent? Yes, there's an exception, and Jesus states it in Matthew 19:9, and I don't suppose I need to even read it. You know what it is. In fact, but the problem, I'm afraid, is that very often we have spent more time talking about the exception than we have the rule. In a language class at school, you learn the rule, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, if there's an exception, they trot out the exception. Now, there is an exception. Jesus states, whosoever shall put away his wife's saving for the cause of fornication and shall marry another committeth adultery. And whoever marries her that is put away doth commit adultery. Now, I believe that if a partner is definitely guilty of fornication or of unfaithfulness, then that partner can be put away in another marriage form. But that's the exception to the rule, and it is an exception that certainly should not occur to anybody when they're getting married, and it's an exception that should not even occur to us who are married. And it is only when it becomes a bold, bald sin that we just have to face and cannot avoid that we then have to deal with that. But let's not become so concerned and interested in discussing the exception that we forget the rule. The rule is that when a marriage is formed, it's for good, it's for keeps, it's permanent. And we just have to work out the problems that come our way if we're going to please God. Though we may sacrifice some happiness in this life because of a bad choice, the happiness of eternity will compensate for whatever suffering we have to endure in this life, following the will of the Lord. We're going to sing an invitation song here, one stanza. If there's one here who's not a Christian, one who has been unfaithful and who needs to make a public statement, we would encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity as we sing. Reading how I love to proclaim everything I love, reading to goodness and mercy is why whatever I have. Reading
to come here to sing songs to your name, honor, glory, and to hear this wonderful message from your word. Pray, Heavenly Father, that each and every one of our homes will be strengthened from this, that we might be able to live closer in our family lives. We might be able to serve thee better in the future than we have in the past. Pray, Heavenly Father, that you would forgive us of our sins and our shortcomings. Carry us to our homes and respective places in life. Bring us back to the next upon that. For some Christ's name we pray.